here today to talk about insight work that I've undertaken into the behavioural determinants of economic inactivity amongst early retirees in rural areas of North Yorkshire. So what I'm going to cover today then is a bit of the background to the research, go through the aims and the research questions, a little bit of context about retirement, and then talk you through the method that I took, go through the findings for the survey and the interviews, pull that together into a bit of a summary, and then talk through some recommendations, opportunities for further research, and then a few acknowledgements and references, and then hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end. Hopefully that sounds okay. So where this all came from was the Combined Authority did some research about 18 months ago and found that the number of people aged 50 to 64 in North Yorkshire who were economically inactive due to early retirement was higher than the national average, and they were sort of intrigued by this. And they'd also kind of spotted that since 2020 there had been a decrease in the percentage of the total number of economically inactive people in York and North Yorkshire who wanted to return to paid work, and they sort of wanted to understand a bit more about what was going on with all of this. And the reason why we focused on Craven and Ryedale was that they are the sort of areas which have particularly rural geography and had the highest percentages of economically inactive people overall. So the Combined Authority wanted to understand whether some people had retired early by choice and were financially fine, no problems, and maybe some people perhaps hadn't retired early by choice and perhaps were having a bit of financial difficulty. And also the data that they looked at showed that people didn't really want to return to work, but they kind of wanted to examine that a bit further and just see whether that sort of genuinely was the case and were there any circumstances whereby people might want to return to the workforce. And again, in terms of the sort of rural focus, there's just not a lot of data around economic inactivity in rural areas, so they were quite keen to kind of understand a bit more about that. So the aim then was to identify the behavioural determinants of economic inactivity among early retirees aged 50 to 64 living in Craven and Ryedale. So as Chris said, the Behavioural Science Unit was commissioned to undertake that piece of work. And this kind of fell into three key research questions. So the first thing was, what's leading people to retire early? Secondly, how are they experiencing retirement? And what are the barriers and enablers around early retirees in Craven and Ryedale returning to paid work? So just a little bit about retirement age then. This research took place in autumn winter 25, and at that time the pension age was 66, but of course the people that I interviewed were all born between 1961 and 1969. So at the start of their working lives, the retirement age was different. It was younger. So it was 60 for women and 65 for men. And then there was a change for women between 2010 and 2018, and then by the time 2020 came around, it was 66 for everyone. So this is relevant just because at the start of their working careers, the concept of retirement would have been slightly different, and then it changed during their careers. In terms of the method then, two elements. There was a survey for which we had 189 respondents, had to just kind of cleanse that and make sure that everybody met the criteria. So there were 140 people who we could actually sort of include in the analysis. And then at the end of the survey, people were asked whether they'd be willing to take part in an interview. And so I then went on to interview 11 people via Teams with a semi-structured interview. And everything that I did was grounded in behavioural science. So some of you might be familiar with the behaviour change wheel, and the key sort of things to focus on for the gathering of insights are the green section in the middle and the yellow section. So the green section is COM-B, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. And then surrounding that, the yellow section is the theoretical domains framework. And so I made sure that these ran through everything I did, the survey design, the interview questions, and also the analysis, just to make sure everything was robust and evidence-based. So thinking about COM-B then, so this works on the theory that for a particular behaviour to take place, whether that's an individual or a group, people must have the psychological and physical capability to do it, the physical and social opportunity, and the reflective and automatic motivation. And then what the TDF, the theoretical domains framework, does, it expands those 3 core areas into 14 sort of groups of behavioural influences, if you like. Things such as knowledge and skills, the environmental context, social influences, professional role and identity, emotion, all those kind of factors. So all of these kind of went into the design of the survey and the interviews. So of those 140 people, 66% female, 31% male, 3% preferred not to say. 1 person was Black, African or Caribbean. Again, 10 preferred not to say, and 129 were white. 61% from Craven and 39% from Ryedale. And 80% of the survey respondents already lived in Craven or Ryedale when they retired. Whereas 20% of them, there was a kind of correlation between the time at which they retired and the time at which they lived in Craven and Ryedale. So the suggestion being that some of them had sort of retired to Craven or Ryedale. And one of the things we asked them was whether they undertook any voluntary activities, and just over half of them did. So although they weren't in paid work, they were still kind of contributing in a slightly different way. In terms of the sectors that they worked in during their careers, it's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see over on the left, education and health and social work sectors were really highly represented in the data with the survey, which was quite interesting, and we kind of come back to a little bit later. So from the survey, as I said, I recruited 11 people to take part in the interviews. 7 people in Craven, 4 in Ryedale, pretty even split on gender, and their ages range from 56 to 64. They were all white, and as you can see, they'd lived in Craven or Ryedale for either between 3 and 58 years, so quite a big range really. And in terms of how long they'd been retired for, that ranged between 6 months and 8.5 years. 2 of them had retired to Craven or Ryedale. One of them had sort of relocated from a neighbouring area because they knew that by doing so they could afford to retire. And for 8 of them, there wasn't any correlation. So they'd lived in Craven or Ryedale for quite a long time. So the location didn't sort of influence them retiring early. In terms of the employment sectors for the interviewees, then again, it's quite sort of spread. As you can see there, health and social work, got 3 people, public administration defence, 2 people. So kind of that kind of sector again is quite well represented. And as I've got there, 8 participants worked in the public sector for most of their careers. In terms of moving on to the survey findings then, looking at people's opportunity and motivation, they were asked to provide up to 3 reasons for why they retired early. Most of them responded to this. And as you can see, the top reason was being in a financial position to do so. And then there were these other reasons as well. So things like burnout and stress, job dissatisfaction, being influenced by other people around them retiring, organisational changes, caring responsibilities, that kind of thing. So kind of tailing sort of down. So things like physical health and mental health, although they were sort of present as factors, they weren't as sort of significant, if you like, as things like the job dissatisfaction and the burnout and stress, which I thought was quite interesting. And then we asked them was there anything that could have prevented them from retiring early, and not so many people responded to this, but their sort of top 3, they could give up to 3 answers, and the things that they came up with were a more supportive organisational culture, greater job satisfaction, reduction in working hours. So it's sort of a bit like the flip side of the previous question, really. Increased income, flexibility, whether that's kind of their working pattern or their working location. And then asked them, was there anything that they missed about work? Income was the biggest one, but quite a few people missed the social aspect. So whether that was interacting with customers, clients or pupils, or whether it's kind of with their colleagues. But quite a lot of people sort of miss that social side of it. Work being part of their sense of identity, job purpose or satisfaction, the learning and development, and then the problem solving. So those are the kind of things that they missed. And then I asked them again in the survey, how appealing was the idea of returning to work? And for 62 of them, so about half the people who responded, they sort of not at all. But for the other half, there was some interest in returning to paid work. And about 3/4 of those people who had a sort of a level of interest in returning to paid work thought it wouldn't be that difficult to do, which I thought raised quite an interesting question, really, because it's kind of, if you're sort of reasonably interested in returning to paid work and it's not that difficult, why aren't people doing it? And unfortunately, I couldn't answer that question because none of the interviewees expressed that sentiment. So I couldn't kind of put that to them, but we'll come back to that later because that is something that could be looked into further if you wanted to. And then in terms of this group of people again, so these 61 people who had an interest in returning to paid work, in terms of the type of work that they'd be interested in, I thought this was significant. A lot of them would be interested in part-time work. 38 as opposed to only 2 would be interested in full-time work. So that taps into that kind of flexibility that they mentioned in some of the other questions. And then self-employment is quite a significant one. And some of them would be interested in learning a new role. Right, I've got my title at the bottom here because of my table. So the type of paid work they preferred to do if they did return, mapped against how easy or difficult it would be. So again, I've got highlighted in green here the part-time work. So for the people who think, yeah, it'd be quite straightforward to go back to work, but if I was going to do that, I'd want to do it part-time. And this raises the question of kind of, why aren't they? Are those opportunities perhaps not there for them? So I know I'm going at a rate, but we've got quite a lot to get through. So next one then, the question around why it would be easy or difficult to return to paid work. So in terms of why people thought it would be fairly easy, they were confident in their skills and experience. They felt, they're in pretty good health. They were willing to be flexible. For a few of the people, 9 of the people sort of said, there are job opportunities out there. And then for a small group, only 4, they sort of said that, they're already self-employed, so, they're already kind of doing it. And in terms of the barriers then, why would it be difficult to return to paid work? This theme again about flexibility and time kind of came up. Enjoying their retirement, they're having too much of a nice time, some of them. Caring responsibilities, physical health. This was a bit of a quirk that came out, this thing about a perception that workplaces have too great a focus on equality, diversity and inclusion. That was only 7 people, but it was interesting that came out. Age discrimination was there for a few people, and for some feeling kind of a bit out of touch with the technical aspects of a role, and then a lack of jobs in the sector. Okay, so that's the survey. So then we kind of got to ask a bit more detail from people with the interview findings. So what I did with this then, I'd kind of use COM-B and TDF to design the survey and to design the interview questions. So then I could kind of keep those running through my analysis and use them to develop my themes. So I'm just going to have a quick sip of water. Going back to those 3 research questions, then the first one was all about what are the factors leading people to retire early? And the first theme that kind of came through was intellectual capability and qualification. So this falls under their psychological capability. So all of them possess the necessary intellectual skills and knowledge to be employed in skilled professional roles throughout their careers. 82% had college or university qualifications. And it's interesting that all of them experience high levels of enjoyment at work for the majority of their careers. And then in terms of the areas that they particularly enjoyed, so they liked working with people, the job itself, problem solving came through as quite a strong theme. If you remember on the previous slide, one of the things that people missed was problem solving. And definitely the interviewees I talked to, they loved the problem solving. The job satisfaction, the variety of the roles and leading or managing a team, people really enjoyed as well. Okay, and then the second theme was around their physical opportunity in terms of how much money they could earn throughout their career. So most of them experienced opportunities for career progression, and with that would come increased salaries with the sort of more senior roles. 8 of them sort of specifically referenced contributing to an enhanced pension scheme, and 6 of them specifically talked about investing and savings. So that was, I didn't ask them about that. They volunteered that information. So yeah, so they were kind of saving throughout their lives. And then in terms of this kind of all feeds in, so they were sort of in pretty well paid jobs because they were well qualified, and they got good pensions and they were able to save. And so 10 of the 11 were already in a financial position to retire early when they began seriously thinking about it. And the other person I mentioned earlier who'd relocated, they sort of just created the circumstances where they had got the financial position to do it. And I'll just give you a second to read that quote. And yeah, and something else that came up was that 4 of the people I talked to had kind of actually sat down, done the maths, and thought, do you know what, if I stayed in work, it's not really going to improve my pension. So they didn't see that there was much point in doing that. The 4th theme then was COVID, physical opportunity, and this was mentioned by 5 people, so just under half. And it was interesting because it affected people in a myriad of ways. So of those 5 people, there were sort of 4 different effects. So for some, it increased their work-related stress. For some, they kind of saw a whole new world of working from home and didn't want to go back to the office or do that kind of commute that they'd been doing before. And then for another person I spoke to, the reverse was true. So he really missed being in the office and didn't like the fact that they were now having to work from home. And then for one person, they just felt like the experience of being at home during COVID just made them think, actually, if I simplified my life, I could retire. So it just kind of got them to see things through a different lens. And then social influence. This came up a bit earlier in one of the slides. So 6 people were influenced in their decision to retire by the actions of others. So whether that was a spouse or a partner, a colleague, or for one person, it was actually a colleague changed direction with their career, and it just caused them to kind of think, oh, what am I doing with my career, and sort of reflect on things. This was one, theme 6 was about respect for increased knowledge or wisdom, because one of the things you could think about early retirees is are people retiring because of ageism, and actually that didn't come through particularly in the interviews. So for 10 of the people I spoke to, they found that the older they got, the more experienced and knowledgeable they got, the more they were respected. And for 8 of them, they kind of really spoke quite a lot about younger people in the profession, kind of seeking them out and asking sort of their sort of wisdom and advice. Conversely, there was one person who sort of found it difficult to adapt to new versions of technology, and something that came through from this is it sounded to me like the training was not adequate for what they were being asked to do, but they felt, you can read the quotes there, they felt that the way that they were being perceived by others, by sort of younger colleagues, was, well, a boring old fuddy-duddy. So this person did sort of feel that they experienced ageism. And interestingly, 2 of the interviewees sort of said, quite clearly, oh, once you hit 55, that's it. They just don't bother investing in you anymore because there's no point training you because they know you're going to go soon. And then you've got that quote at the end, I feel wasted. I think I could have done much more. So there was a bit of that kind of going on. In terms of reflective motivation then, so thinking about people's intentions or plans regarding retirement, the 9 out of the 11 people I spoke to had a really clear idea, a plan that they were going to retire early. 5 of them went even earlier than they'd intended, and 3 of them went bang on when they were planning to. And then one person actually retired early, got offered a great job, went back and retired early again. And then for 2 of them, they didn't have a specific age in mind, but they just kind of created the circumstances where if they wanted to retire early, they knew that they could. So as this person said, I'll go with the flow, and then circumstance can very much dictate your decision making. So for them, it didn't matter what age it was, they just wanted to be in the position where they could make that decision if they wanted to. In terms of reevaluating work-life balance, so this was a factor for 5 people, and that was kind of seeing things happening to people around them, and sort of being influenced them, just giving them kind of pause for thought, do I want to keep working? Do I want to live a slightly different life? So that played a part for them. And then for 73%, so quite a high proportion, organisational changes. So a new leader came in and they didn't like them, or for a couple of people, their organisation became privatised, or there was a restructure and they just really didn't like how it was handled. And so this kind of touching back on that point earlier of just creating the financial circumstances so you can make the decision when you want to. So this person that we didn't see eye to eye, I could go, so I just went. The next theme then was about feeling demoralized or stressed or burnt out by work. So this is kind of automatic motivation, so kind of emotional response to work. And 8 of the participants had experienced this, which is high, really. 8 out of 11 is really quite high. And there are a variety of reasons. Managing a large team, too much work, lots of responsibility, particularly sort of for vulnerable people, having to sort of justify things, aggression, not feeling heard, the sort of frustrations around systems and processes not working. For some people, it was about not feeling aligned to the attitudes and values of their colleagues, or maybe kind of trying to help people who didn't want to be helped, and sort of work politics as well. And then there's a quote there, just kind of that alluding to sort of there's just been too much work. It was never possible to achieve it, and which that person found really demoralizing. And I just put a little note in here about physical capability, because one of the things when I was talking to Chris about this piece of research, one of the things we talked about was could we have a situation where people have done a very physical job and actually I don't know, they've got a problem with their knees or something and they can't do that job anymore, so that's why they're retiring early, and that didn't come through with the people that I interviewed, so I just thought I'd mention that. And then in terms of how retirement is experienced by the early retirees, they were having a very nice time is what kind of came across. So 73% of them sort of enjoyed the extra time, the freedom, the flexibility, and just being able to please themselves, really. They really loved that. 6 of them just didn't miss work at all, but of course that means that 5 of them did in some way. So for 5 of them, they sort of missed the buzz and the adrenaline of the job. And then for 7 of them, they missed the people from work, but they'd kind of found ways of sort of filling that gap, some of them, largely through volunteering, actually, kind of interacting with people in a different context. And then this is how they spent their retirement: lots of hobbies, volunteering. A lot of them talked about having time to do an energy to do exercise that they haven't been able to do before, spending time with family, traveling. And then 4 of them were working part-time or had set up their own business. So yeah, that's what they were up to. And then in terms of the barriers and enablers, so the people I interviewed, they didn't really have a desire to return to paid work. If those who kind of were wanting to do something were already doing it, so whether that was a part-time job or they'd set up their own business, and 10 of them were really quite confident that if they were a bit dismissive if I said, what if you had to go back to work? Oh no, that'll never happen. And I was kind of like, well, heaven forbid, the circumstances mean that you really have to. And they said, oh yeah, I'm confident I could kind of get a job, that's fine. But there's one person who wasn't confident. I think they sort of felt that a bit like there weren't many jobs that were relevant to them anymore. So that was interesting. And then, again, kind of touching on this point, remember earlier I said that 4 of the people had said that they worked out that they wouldn't really add a huge amount more to their pension if they stayed working. And then, yeah, tax came up, was mentioned quite a bit. So I've already paid a lot of tax. If I went back to work, I'd have to pay a load more tax. Kind of, why would I do that? They sort of saw that as a bit of a disincentive, really. Okay, so in terms of just kind of pulling all that together, sorry, I realise I've just given you a lot of information. So if the Combined Authority would like to reduce the number of economically inactive people due to early retirement, there are two potential things we could focus on. So influence the factors leading people to retire early, or support people back to work. Oh yeah, and the way that I kind of organized this was thinking about sort of individual level factors, which are generally the least complex to intervene with, but also have the lowest potential for affecting huge change, really. And then you've kind of got things at an organizational level, and then systems level, really complex to intervene with, but if you can do it successfully, huge potential for affecting change. And so the way I've kind of put this together is I've under each of my next little sections, I've kind of referenced the theoretical domains framework component in sort of normal font, if you like, and then the COM-B component is in the brackets, and then underneath we've got in italics the level at which to focus. So the first bit then, influencing the factors leading people to retire early. So a real strong primary factor that came through was that people were in the financial position to do it. And then, of course, there were all these secondary factors that kind of tip them into doing it. So things like burnout and organizational changes. And so what came through quite strongly was that kind of the idea of sort of part-time working and flexible working arrangements, that they would kind of help people with things like caring responsibilities, physical and mental health. And also thinking about voluntary redundancy. I mean, there's one person I spoke to who they were in the position where they knew they could retire early, but they had no real plan to do it. And then they just got offered the most amazing voluntary redundancy package. And so they retired. And so that's something that would have to be looked at an organizational level, if we don't want people to do that. And then obviously COVID-19 is a really difficult thing, but just something to bear in mind for the future of the various ways in which something similar affects different people, and how that affects potentially affects early retirees. So the next thing then, thinking about social influences and social opportunities. So this is a bit of a catch-22 or chicken and egg sort of thing. So if you influence other things so that fewer people are retiring earlier, then fewer people retire earlier, if that makes sense, because people are influenced by what other people are doing. So that will kind of take care of itself. And then the organizational factors. So where workplace experiences have influenced people's decisions to retire early, then a bit more research might be needed around that, exactly kind of what's been going on with that. And again, that's at an organizational level. Thinking about emotion then, so things like burnout and stress and job dissatisfaction and organizational changes. So these are all rooted in sort of systems and organizations. So further research would sort of be needed to unpick all of that and what's causing all of that. And then if it was something like job dissatisfaction, then it might be that there's something around knowledge or skills there and upskilling people. But again, just need to find out a bit more about that. And what was interesting was one of the questions was kind of hypothetically, say back in your mid-50s, if you'd had the opportunity to retrain, do something completely different, would you have been up for doing that? And of the people who were interested in that, they'd only do it if they could retain their salary and their pension. So they weren't interested in kind of having a whole new career but dropping right back down in terms of their income. Because that was one of the things we were thinking about, was like, is there a retraining opportunity here? So yeah, something to bear in mind. And then the thing about sort of reflective motivation around work-life balance, and that's kind of linked to this idea of anticipated regret. When we get a bit of a wake-up call and we think, oh gosh, if I carry on working for X number of years, will I regret it? Because if something goes wrong, will I wish I'd retired early to spend more time with my loved ones or travel or whatever my sort of dreams are? But yeah, one of the ways that you could kind of get around that maybe would be this idea of, again, of kind of part-time or flexible working or more meaningful work, so that people, they kind of get the best of both worlds. So they feel like they can do those things that add quality to their lives, but potentially still sort of remain in the workforce as well. And then in terms of people who would like to return to paid work, this wasn't present, this sentiment wasn't present amongst the interviewees, and the ones who did were already kind of doing it. But there is this group that I mentioned earlier, the 61 people from the survey who found it to some degree appealing, and 3/4 of them thought it wouldn't be that difficult to do. I'd be really interested to know why they aren't doing it. I think that is something that could be looked into further. Right then, supporting early retirees who wish to return to work. 15 people found the idea relatively appealing, and also very difficult to do or difficult to do. So I was having a think about the barriers that people had kind of given for this. And so they talked about returning to work would restrict their flexibility. They were having too much of a nice time being retired. They got their caring responsibilities and physical health. These were kind of the key things that came out. And if 62 people gave these as barriers, potentially they could all be overcome with part-time or flexible working arrangements. So again, that's really quite a strong theme that came through with this research. And then in terms of how they're spending their time, I mentioned before, kind of hobbies and exercise and that kind of thing. They're enjoying their free time. A lot of them were doing volunteering. And that's something, again, that can be sort of encouraged further. We know it's sort of good for mental health and well-being. Some of them were kind of doing formal volunteering roles. It was kind of at a community level generally, and others were just doing kind of informal things that just make places nicer to live in, really. So they were doing a kind of mixture of things. One person was doing some mentoring of young people at a local college, and what came through with the interviewees was that 8 of them talked quite a bit about enjoying mentoring young people and enjoying seeing people reach their full potential and kind of grow and progress. And so it was just a thought really around whether it's worth exploring whether there's any appetite amongst early retirees for kind of formalising this. So there being some kind of mentoring scheme where people who've retired early mentor or coach people earlier on in their career. So kind of reinvesting their skills and wisdom and expertise, really. But I mean, they didn't come up with that idea. That you'd kind of need to investigate that further and see whether they actually really wanted to do that before kind of developing a whole scheme around it. And as I mentioned earlier, so most of the people already lived in Craven and Ryedale, so they weren't retiring there. So a key question I think could be, what is it about living in North Yorkshire that's making it possible to retire early more so than in other areas of the UK? Because things like burnout or caring responsibilities or reevaluating work-life balance, they're kind of universal factors that affect everyone in the UK, not just people in North Yorkshire. So I would be really interested to know, what is it about salaries, pensions, cost of living in North Yorkshire and the gap between those that means it's possible to retire there more so than in the rest of the UK. Right, moving on then. I hope we're okay for time. I've no idea what time it is. I'll just keep going until Chris tells me to stop. So in terms of recommendations for intervention, opportunities to influence decisions around early retirement or re-engagement with the workforce. So I have got the caveat with this that these are kind of suggestions, and there is further research that is needed with quite a few of these. I'm not suggesting just kind of go off and do this stuff. We've kind of got the start of some ideas here, and they kind of need exploring further, really. So I've put these in order of the things that I think kind of stood out the most. The first one is the flexible working arrangements and workplace adjustments, which would kind of tackle quite a few of those things. give people the best of both worlds, enable them to sort of do the things they want to do or they need to do, but also kind of remain in the workforce. Organizational restructure. They have quite a profound effect on people. It is what kind of came through from the interviews. So this is kind of an organizational level thing, but thinking about how organizations could manage this better or differently so that people are less impacted by it. Voluntary redundancy, thinking about sort of a holistic approach to financial organization of companies, I suppose, and thinking about other alternatives to that, because if it's offered to people, then there's a chance they're going to take it. Meaningful work. So as you remember, the interviewees I spoke to, they largely kind of really enjoyed their jobs. They were progressing, they were feeling stretched, they were, challenged, they were getting to mentor other people, they were solving problems. So yeah, but there's something around for people who kind of aren't experiencing that, then trying to sort of tailor work to people. What is it when people are thinking, I'm in the financial position to retire, so I will? What is it that would just kind of keep them engaged and give them that kind of challenge that would make them think, actually, it's worth sort of staying? The equality, diversity, inclusion I mentioned earlier, for some people, they felt that there was too much of a focus on this, and I think that needs unpicking. To understand why they feel that way, and maybe some educational training around that, and possibly a bit of upskilling for people who feel out of touch. But that was only one interviewee, so I'd sort of be cautious about investing too much in that, and then potentially sort of boosting job numbers. But again, all the interviewees felt like, apart from one, felt they could go back if they wanted to. So yeah, again, caution with that one. And then, oh, sorry, I got two more. So age discrimination, where that's present, thinking about education and appropriate HR policies. And then, there's obviously a lot that can sort of learn from the impact of COVID-19 when we're thinking about early retirees and considering the potential impact of that, of something similar in the future. Okay, moving on to opportunities for further research. This is coming back to the point I made a few minutes ago about thinking about North Yorkshire as a place. And I'm not an expert on financial stuff, but I just had a little look. I thought, I wonder if people in North Yorkshire who are teachers and the same as people in Surrey who are teachers. I did a very basic look, and I think they do. I think the teaching scale, for example, is the same. And it just made me think, so if it's more expensive to live in Surrey than in North Yorkshire and you're earning the same, that suggests to me that it's possibly easier to retire early in North Yorkshire. There is no evidence kind of in that. That's just a thought, really. But I just really think that's kind of worth looking into further, because the financial element came through quite strongly. And then we've kind of got these general terms that we sort of used in the survey. We'd like a more supportive organisational culture. We'd like greater job satisfaction. I think really kind of getting stuck into what does that actually mean? What does that look like for people? So because we could kind of guess, couldn't we, and put all sorts of well-being things in place or whatever, but until we actually ask people, we don't know what it means for them. So I think that would be an interesting thing to research. And then that group from the survey who were interested in returning to paid work, didn't think it'd be that challenging to do so, asking them, sort of why, so how come aren't you, what's getting in the way? The volunteer career mentoring program that I mentioned, I'd suggest kind of talking to early retirees about that and see whether that's something that would appeal to them. Going right back to the beginning, there was that graph with the survey respondents, and we had quite a few people who'd responded to the survey from these sectors, education, health and social work. Is there something going on there? Maybe sort of workplace experiences or social norms around early retirement that could kind of be looked into. I mean, that's a whole massive system, so that's quite a big piece of work. And then thinking about any potential regional economic or workforce risks associated with a higher than average group of people retiring early in North Yorkshire. Oh, I made it. Right. So a few acknowledgements I'd like to make, please. I would really like to thank everybody who took part in the survey and the interviews. I just always think it's so generous of people to do this and to give their time and energy and thought to this, and I really appreciate it. So I'd like to thank them. I'd like to thank our partners. Lots of people gave me ideas and put me in touch with people and kind of shared the survey and encouraged people to take part. Some of whom are listed there, so I'd like to thank them for their help with that. And lots of people at North Yorkshire Council also helped me in various different ways. So I would like to thank all of them. And there's just a few references in there for bits and bobs I've included.